In the first season, My Adventures with Superman cemented itself as an incredibly unique and really well handled take on the Man of Steel and his lore, with a heavy focus on making these characters as cute as possible. Then, in a new TV landscape where Season 2's come out multiple years after Season 1, My Adventures with Superman is a return to the old formula, with Season 2 coming out just 9 months after Season 1 ended, and what I'll be doing in this video is a bit of a mid-season review, going over the first 5 episodes out of 10 of Season 2, and reviewing each one. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, leave a like, and help me get to 100,000 subscribers, and let's begin. Before we go episode by episode, let's talk about some generalizations which are true for every episode of the season. For instance, the animation. Now I'll be honest, during Season 1 the animation was never incredibly impressive or anything, but certainly was good enough to carry the season. This time around, Season 2 has the misfortune of releasing right after X-Men 97, which just showed a higher level of animation, one that makes this series look a little bit worse by comparison. It shouldn't be judged in comparison to something else, but it's hard not to when X-Men 97 was the very last thing I reviewed on this channel. In a vacuum, the animation is, like in Season 1, perfectly adequate, allowing the fight scenes to do their job, with some being memorable, but most honestly just being fine. And similarly are the visuals, which cover similar but distinct aspects of the way the show looks compared to the animation. And yet again, X-Men 97 makes this show look worse in comparison, but just like during Season 1, the visuals do look pretty great, whether that be in the art style, character designs, colors, or scenery. The voice acting is pretty great for the most part, with most characters being perfectly cast, all being the perfect voices for these takes on these characters. The writing is really good for the most part as well, not necessarily always, and it's not necessarily incredible writing, but it gets the job done, although more so in the dialogue than the storytelling, which at least for now isn't quite up to par with Season 1. And finally, the music mostly does a good job as well, with some really standout moments where the background music is fantastic. The intro is the same as the Season 1 intro, and it's not incredible or anything, but it is pretty good. Okay, so let's begin with the individual episode reviews, starting with episode 1 titled More Things in Heaven and Earth, following up on the ending of Season 1 with the dream sequence that sets the tone for the season going forward, and does a good job at that, with the most important thing being the reveal to Clark that there is another person like him. This comes back later when Kara is revealed for the first time. What I don't love is that beginning in this episode and up until her appearance, it feels like the show forces Clark to not be able to tell Lois about her. Like, he has so many opportunities, but the show clearly wants to force a wedge between them, and it feels so unnatural. It's less of a problem in this episode and more so down the line, although it is definitely present here as well. Aside from the Supergirl of it all, this episode, being the first of the season, has to set up a lot of things, not the least of which includes introducing the show's version of the Fortress of Solitude, doing so throughout the episode taking place primarily in this Kryptonian ship, which ends up transforming into the Fortress, which I thought was a great way to go about it. I especially loved the music of the Fortress in this episode, especially during the end when it actually transformed. In this ship we see Jor-El finally allowed to speak English, which does quite a lot for the character. Firstly, Krypton's lore is revealed here, having been pretty drastically changed from the comics into an empire which was destroyed by a more powerful enemy it tried to take over, seemingly Apocalypse. This lore explanation was well handled, with the change being an interesting one, feeling very inspired by Invincible, and sets up Darkseid to have a personal connection to Krypton and Superman, which is pretty interesting. Beyond that, Jor-El has an entire personality. He's likable, feels very human, and even helps out. That, combined with Clark feeling like he had a lot more questions to ask, makes Jor-El's quote-unquote death or his destruction feel kinda sad. I was just beginning to like him. This episode introduces Damage, a new member of Task Force X, who is a bit one-dimensional, at least for now, but is the primary source of action in this episode, with the Superman versus Damage fight being short but still pretty good, which is pretty much true for every fight scene in this season. They're all mostly pretty short but pretty good. From very early on, we're introduced to this running gag that will likely last for the entire season of Jimmy spending an exorbitant amount of money, having gotten a lot of money at the end of the last season. I think this joke is funny, and I love how it gives the season an excuse to do a lot of what would otherwise be basically impossible because of how expensive it is. But Jimmy's net worth goes down way too quickly. Like, how do Valentine's Day cards cost $100,000? Like, that is crazy. I really can't appreciate this joke when the numbers are this ridiculous. Also, very early on, and also related to Jimmy, as the trio head to Star Labs, they run into Alex from the previous season. There was a theory going around last season that Alex was this show's version of Lex Luthor, and this was confirmed in this season, and I am loving how they are handling it. For this episode, Jimmy starts the lexification of Alex by inspiring him to believe in himself. An interesting twist on this cliche: one of the main characters inspires someone to believe in themselves, but that turns them into the hero's primary antagonist. It's just this one scene in this episode, but every episode going forward has some Lex Luthor buildup, which quickly became my favorite aspect of the season, which I'll get back to because it's in every episode. All things considered, this was a great episode that does a lot of great things and manages to set up the rest of the season pretty well, even if it does have some shortcomings. Episode 2 is titled Adventures with My Girlfriend and begins with an Amanda Waller focused scene showing how she starts her days, which is an interesting insight into the character, followed by the reveal of how Sam is being held. The scenes of Amanda Waller interrogating Sam are really well written, well voiced, and pretty intense. It feels like Waller fully taking over Task Force X, which is true for the entire episode because of the reveal that Waller is experimenting on civilians in order to create living weapons like Livewire. Task Force X goes even further from morally gray to just straight up villainous. In order to save Sam, Superman and Lois team up, which is mostly really fun. These two characters still have incredible chemistry even past their flirtatious stage. Where there is conflict between them though, whether that be Clark being cut off regarding Kara for what feels like the third time already, or Lois defending her father from Clark. It's not great, it feels like forced drama, and the constant cutting off is so frustrating. The conflict between Lois and Sam, however, is a lot more interesting and is well built up in this and the following few episodes. During the rescue operation, Superman faces off against the newly introduced villain, Atomic Skull, a classic Superman villain and newest recruit to Task Force X. First of all, I love the design, I love the way his powers look. The Superman versus Atomic Skull fight is pretty good, and it's great to see an actual Superman villain on the show. That story ends converging with another, Jimmy story, which I'll be honest, I actually just genuinely do not like. Jimmy is head of the video department of the Daily Planet and works with Steve Lombard in the Newsboy Legion, and I'll be honest, this is kind of the most difficult thing for me to suspend my disbelief on in the entire series. It's just ridiculous that they would hire a bunch of children as interns. First of all, that's kind of just child slave labor, but also they spent millions of dollars on Flamebird, so this is a multi-million-dollar operation here, and they can't hire a few new employees who are, you know, like adults. To me, it feels like they wanted to keep the Newsboy Legion around but couldn't think of another way to do so. And honestly, I think the show would have been better off had they just cut them out of the show completely, because this is just ridiculous and breaks my immersion with the series a bit. The two storylines converge on a scene where Jimmy's ship helps the prisoners escape, and for all intents and purposes, it's a fine ending to both storylines. What it does accomplish more than anything is it gives Amanda Waller a pretty substantial and public loss that makes her desperate enough to then recruit Lex Luthor. This scene right here is my favorite part of an otherwise relatively underwhelming episode. I love the switch from season 1 of Lex now literally walking over Ivo. I love the change in Lex's tone and line delivery, the confidence he now exudes, and the air of mystery over whether or not he was the one who let Ivo out so he could save Waller, something Lex Luthor would absolutely do. It got to the point where I was kind of excited when he referred to himself as Lex Luthor for the first time. I have never been more excited to see someone lose his hair. Oh, also, Sam goes to live with Clark and Jimmy, a weird turn of events that is weird for Lois to suggest, weird for Sam to agree to, and weird for Clark not to push back against, and frankly, it never really amounted to anything either. This episode, I think, has some really strong moments, but there are aspects of it I really didn't like. Episode 3 is titled Fullmetal Scientist and begins with one of the bigger DC Universe expansions in the introduction of Silas Stone, and with Livewire mentioning his son, who is 9 or 10, a reference to Victor Stone, who can become Cyborg a few years later. Had they not told me Silas's name, I would have assumed it was John Henry Irons, who also appears in this episode having a large role and even becoming Steel. Well, kinda. In the comics, John Henry Irons was a huge Superman fan who became a hero after Superman's death. Here they kind of flip it by having Clark be a fan of John Henry's, a twist that I found interesting. Steel's design is good for a prototype, and I think was maybe purposely made to look both like Steel and Lex Luthor's suit, given what happens at the end of the episode. I'd love for John, however, to develop a sleeker, more comic-accurate suit later on. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of John's voice. I don't know, there's just something off about it, like it doesn't quite fit right to me. Anyway, sticking to John Henry Irons, this episode introduces Amertek, its CEO Thomas Weston, and the Metallos. On one hand, I really like Thomas Weston as a villain, having a really loud and chaotic personality that adds a high level of energy to the episode that works really well. On the other hand, this adaptation of Metallo absolutely sucks. This show has so many robots, and Metallo is just another one of them. If there isn't some other use of Metallo down the road, maybe some combination of things, then this is an incredible disappointment, maybe the biggest failure of a Superman character in this show. Steel's presence also connects to Clark, who struggles with writer's block throughout the episode, culminating in him writing about Steel helping Superman, which really fits his character. He can't bring himself to write a story praising himself, but loves to write about someone else being a hero. I really like this, and it was a lot of fun to see Superman and Steel teaming up with each other, because it's just always a lot of fun to see classic hero-sidekick duos fighting together. Also because this final showdown has some really great animation, visuals, and music, as well as a large focus on this power of Superman's that's introduced in this episode, extending his protective field. This is one of his more obscure powers, but it is something that he has in the comics. This visible take on the power is a unique one that definitely fits this unique take this show has generally taken with Superman's powers and its visuals. Lois and Jimmy have their own side stories in this episode that connect to the main story and are consistently the less interesting parts of the episode. Lois and Vicky's rivalry is fun, a bit weird that they are the only two reporters interested in the story, but Lois being offered a job at the Gotham Gazette is an interesting and unexpected twist, even if it is still nothing shocking. As for Jimmy, his story in this episode just again doesn't hold up compared to the rest of the episode, and it's mainly because of Flip, whose presence as a child intern for the Daily Planet is still so hard to accept. Jimmy even brings this up, saying she shouldn't get involved because she's 11, and somehow the show then treats him like he's in the wrong by the end as he allows Flip to get involved. I know I'm not supposed to take this as seriously as I am, this is still technically a kid's cartoon, but this is some Teen Titans Go level shenanigans happening in an otherwise far more realistic and grounded show, and it just breaks my immersion. The recurring storyline of Clark not being able to tell Lois about Kara continues in this episode and remains a bit frustrating. Sam living with Jimmy and Clark is still really weird, and I don't think the show ever really took advantage of the potential comedy in the situation. In the end of the episode, Lex Luthor shows up again buying out Amertek. Whenever he shows up, he's a bit more confident and a bit more Lex Luthor-y. I love his sinister theme and his voice and how they're seemingly incorporating the Steel prototype suit into being his exosuit. Man, for a show that wanted to avoid Lex Luthor in season 1, they literally had a mandate for it. They're absolutely nailing the character's natural build-up that they kind of just stumbled on. This episode had a lot going for it, especially involving Superman and Steel, and then also Lex Luthor. But again, it could have been far better, and again, there are things that are holding it back. Episode 4 is titled Two Lanes Diverged, and in my opinion is a clear step up in quality from the last two episodes. For starters, I absolutely love this episode's focus on the two relationships it focused on. Firstly, Clark and Jimmy's friendship. In this episode, they really feel like best friends with fantastic chemistry and writing surrounding them. Some of the scenes between them are genuinely so sweet and so heartwarming that it successfully makes this friendship feel more genuine. And then there's Lois and Sam's troubled relationship, their camping trips that were actually Sam training her, and them talking about her mom. All of this was really well written, well voiced, and all around well handled, that I got to the point where when Sam left at the end of the episode, I felt really bad for Lois. She clearly has some abandonment issues due to her mom's absence and her father's emotional distance, and that's something this episode did a great job at showing off. The story was really well written and helps to greatly expand Lois's backstory and character, as well as Sam's. Then, following up on the first 3 episodes of build-up, Lex Luthor is given his largest role yet, in a debate arguing that Superman is a problem. His arguments made sense and were certainly things Lex would genuinely believe and say, but were also easier to debate than the show made it seem. Jimmy isn't really a debater though, so it makes sense he'd be overwhelmed, also because he's busy thinking about he was the one who inspired Lex to step up, which again is an interesting take and so well explored here. I didn't love Jimmy's solo adventures in episodes 2 and 3, but I can't deny the effect on Luthor alongside the focus on his friendship with Clark, and even what his money allows them to do, all made Jimmy feel extremely important to this show's story and identity, more so than most Superman stories and worlds. During Lois and Sam's story of running from Task Force X, the Toyman is introduced, initially seemingly as a good guy. He's revealed to be working for Waller, which I wouldn't say was too surprising given he's a villain in the comics. But, I mean, you never know with how different some of the characters on this show can be. I love to see Toyman become more and more villainous over time, but for now this is a pretty good introduction to the character. Speaking of villains, Superman and Sam Lane face off together against Atomic Skull, Damage, and Deathstroke in a really good and well-animated fight scene that makes really good use of a 3D camera, something that I would love to see utilized more. This was the best fight scene of the season so far, but again, like I mentioned earlier, basically every fight scene in the season is relatively short. I didn't mention it before, but episode 1 introduced Hank Henshaw looking a lot like Clark Kent. This episode also introduces other Superman characters like Emil Hamilton and other DC characters like General Wade Eiling, who alongside Hank Henshaw and Senator Sackett all join Lex and Waller in fighting against Superman, a storyline I'm very interested in seeing where it goes. Finally, the episode ends with Clark calling out to Kara after yet another episode of what feels like forced miscommunication. This leads right into episode 5. Episode 4, however, was pretty great, a lot better than the previous two, with some fantastic focus on character relationships being the standout element, which was definitely enhanced by the superior writing compared to the rest of the season. Episode 5 is titled The Most Eligible Superman, and obviously the most important thing is that it introduces Kara Zor-El. Kara ends up being a huge departure from the comics, firstly in her origin of being sent away from Krypton as a baby, as I mentioned earlier, which this episode justifies in how much of a departure she ends up being. This also changes Kara's characterization pretty drastically, as she was seemingly raised by Brainiac to be a fierce warrior, and this seemingly means that Kara and Clark are also the same age, or at the very least, Kara debuts as an adult. Secondly, with her design, which has a very unique hairstyle, but also is deceptively cute, which works really well first with her initial role of going on a date with Jimmy, which is really cute in its own right, and will likely be very important going forward. I will say it's weird and frustrating that Jimmy never asked what Kara's cousin's name is, but I did like to focus on Jimmy feeling guilty about inspiring Lex, and this story, alongside Kara's frankly adorable design and characterization, then worked so well to make her turn in the end hit way harder than it would have otherwise, and I'll get back to that later. This episode starts with Clark and Lois trying to talk to each other about everything, only to be cut off yet again, which is still very frustrating. The episode does, however, get everything out in the open in the end, and in fact, I think it does end up working really well, at least from Lois's perspective. The previous episode made it clear that she has some justifiable abandonment issues. This episode focuses on the idea that Lois isn't good enough for someone like Superman, as he's crowned the most eligible bachelor in Metropolis. This in particular feels like a very natural insecurity Lois would have given her past, the events of this episode, and her talks with Kat, who practically tells her to her face that she's not good enough for Superman, and frankly, on paper, she's right. And Lois would have to be pretty arrogant to not have these feelings, honestly, so it all feels very natural and a very effective aspect of the episode that makes Lois feel even more fleshed out. Everything surrounding this is a bit less memorable itself, but not only was it necessary for the Lois stuff to work, it connects to Kara's reaction to Superman, and it's just generally really fun. But also there are some standout moments, like I love Clark's reaction to the competition raising money for a kid's hospital, it's adorable, and Silver St. Cloud's design. Silver St. Cloud is a Batman character, but not a truly significant one, and I liked her usage in this episode. What was weird about this episode is that Hank Henshaw was one of the quote-unquote eligible bachelors, despite mentioning in episode 1 that he has a wife. I don't know if that's a continuity error or something else entirely. Obviously, it's in the last 5 minutes of the episode where things get really good. The Kara reveal was insane. I theorized based on the trailer that Kara might be used as a villain, so I guess I wasn't fully shocked. But that doesn't quite change the impact of the scene, which made for a very intense last 5 minutes, makes the reveal of who the Kryptonian warrior a satisfying one, because had it been someone like Zod, it would have felt pointless to keep it a mystery, and it doesn't change the ambition of the entire concept of using Supergirl as a villain, which for now is being executed very well. What followed was a fantastically animated fight and a super impactful mid-season ending, which is by far the strongest story moment of the season so far. In this fight, Kara's armor thankfully breaks a bit, since there's no longer a need for the mystery, which gives her a way better look, one that looks a lot more like an evil Supergirl, rather than a random Kryptonian soldier. I actually just never liked that design entirely. Superman unlocking his freeze breath was a really cool moment as well, one of the better power unlocking scenes in the series. In the end, this episode was easily the best episode of the season so far, making the season finally feel like it's getting really, really interesting. The average rating of the first 5 episodes is a 7.8 out of 10, which for all intents and purposes is pretty good, and I can't imagine the rest of the season not bringing up the average further. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and thanks for watching.